some of the countries that Mass was compared against. Sandra? And if it needs to be, if you need to elaborate on that, we can ask the speaker to try to elaborate if that doesn't make sense.
Singapore was one of them in math.
Okay.
This was on the international.
If you'd like to stand up for this question that was, okay? Yes.
Specifically, my experience has been that we're not so great in education as a whole, and I just found it a little contrary to hear that when you consider Mass as a country that we were ranked so favorably. And one way you can skew numbers, I'm not saying numbers were skewed, but one way numbers can be skewed is to be very selective as to the other groups that you're comparing yourself against. And I was just curious what the other countries were.
Yeah, that's certainly a fair question. And for every test that's been given, the problem is that there's a different constellation of countries. And it's a large constellation, but you might have a slightly different, group of countries for every single test, because countries can decide to sign up for the test. And it's not the entire student body that takes the test. It's a stratified random sample. And the sampling technique is very sophisticated, so they're very careful. Even for NAEP tests in this country, they're very careful about making sure they have stratified random sampling from each state in order to compare the states. And when they do it across countries, they do it at a particular grade, at two different grade levels, 4 and 8, to make sure that they're catching the same age group. And they notice when school entrance age is, to make sure that they're getting kids that are comparable in the number of years of schooling. There are all these considerations that they do take into account. So it's very carefully done, and I don't think anyone has ever seriously challenged the nature of the sample and the conclusions that are drawn from the sample they take. So Singapore is one, Hong Kong, a couple of other South Asian, East Asian countries were the groups that we would be compared with as high competitive groups.
I just wanted to add, because I used to work at the U.S. Department of Education, that the groups that conducted these studies, it's called the TIMSS, and it used to be called TIMSS because it was the Third International Math Science Studies, and then they just kept calling it TIMSS. But the U.S. Department of Education's involved, the governments, the education ministries of a number of these other countries in Europe and Asia involved. It's the most, it's not some fly-by-night group, it's the most credible international study in math science with the major countries, ministries of education, and the U.S. Department of Education. So any study, you can find some flaw in it, but this is really the best, most established studies that we have.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, the next question we have is, how does Common Core get into our school system, and who makes the decision? If the State Board of Education or other relevant agency has made the decision, then all the superintendents in the state are told that they have to use these standards, and states will handle them differently. Superintendents will handle them differently for their staff. So there isn't any one way in which these standards get into a school system. A local district superintendent might simply call, if it's a large one, call all his senior staff and say, or her staff and say, here these are, make sure these filter down to the teachers. And in many cases, this has been the first time the teachers have ever heard about them. This is not unusual in many states where they don't know anything except what they're told from on high, and that's it. And they find out after a decision has been made.
Great, thank you.
Next question. Are teachers at the high school level all required to be on the same page at the same time, or is that only for elementary teachers? Who is writing the new textbooks, or will they be using some current textbooks? That's a very good question. Either one you can address that. Will the teachers be on the same page
if they're all teaching the same class on the high school level as they are in the elementary level? Do we know that? And who is writing the new textbooks? I know who's publishing them. I think it's Pearson. Is it Pearson? Who's the publisher?
Well,
Okay, you can speak.
Okay, I don't want to speak out of term here.
well, all of the big public, Pearson is the 800-pound gorilla in the publishing industry. They dominate the publishing industry. They bought a lot of the smaller ones. So they're trying to dominate that way. And they also dominate the testing industry. And they bought a lot of the smaller testing companies. And they've been a strong backer of Common Core. There's been a couple of private organizations that have donated a fair amount of money behind Common Core, behind some of the development of it and promotion of it. And Pearson's one of them. And the Gates Foundation is the other, probably bigger one. And you know, I'll leave it to all of you to judge if they're both going to benefit, if we have to buy a lot of computers and a lot of new textbooks. But you know, they have been strong backers. And so, but the reality is most of the publishers today view it as a matter of survival if so many states are going to go towards Common Core to provide textbooks to people who are going to teach those standards. And so there are going to be textbooks. Now, a lot of claims that a textbook is aligned to Common Core are just marketing, right? I mean, people involved with the textbook industry know that everybody claims they're aligned to whatever you're using in your state, or they need to make that claim to try to sell it to you. So that doesn't mean they're all perfectly aligned, right? But a lot of them are aligning. Now, I think a lot of them are also starting to look around and notice that some states are having second thoughts, and so they're monitoring that. But there won't be any shortage of books if a lot of states say they're using Common Core. And the other question was, will the elementary and the high school be aligned in some way?
Will they be on the same page? So will every class?
One or two.
All right.
The main thing to remember is that a curriculum is different from a set of standards. Common Core in English is a set of empty skills for the most part. It, like, find the main idea or apply something to whatever you're reading, but the reading can be at any level. It could be The Three Little Pigs or Moby Dick. That's what a skill is, as opposed to a curriculum which specifies the text. And so, unlike the caricature that's been made of a country like France, where everyone is literally on the same page, no matter where you are in the country, this will probably not be the case in this country, except maybe in a school system where a superintendent has said everyone at grade X is going to read the same textbooks. So it could happen in some school systems, but across the country there will be an enormous variation in the textbooks or the particular readings that teachers choose. That is one of the great problems, because what we don't know is where that 50% informational stuff is coming from. What is it? We read examples of assignments, prompts, writing prompts, or what recommendations National Council of Teachers of English is making, or model lessons. And different things are being suggested, so different schools, different classes within a school could be choosing different texts. So kids won't be having exactly the same curriculum. What will be the same are the test items. No matter what the differences are from class to class, school to school, the test items will be the same across the country. And how good they are, as I said, is a big question, because no one's going to be able to see them. Test secure. It's not like they'll be released a year later, as in Massachusetts, which was a good safety check. There's no mechanism built in. So we don't know how good those test items are going to be.
So let me just clarify what I heard, because this is my question.
Well, I'm going to partly address that too, so why don't you?
I wanted to ask about the books. So there won't be a requirement for every school district to buy a whole new set of textbooks starting next year, or will there?
Well,
In some ways.
you know, to some degree, there might be. It's going to vary depending on what they're using now and how well it aligns with Common Core. The reality is that some of the cost estimates that try to claim, well, teachers can There won't be so high cost because teachers can take a lesson from one and take another from another one and a sequence from over here and just try to stitch it all together. And teachers can be pretty creative to do these things when pressed, but the reality is that can also be pretty challenging, and getting a logical sequence of instruction that's well designed and well thought out is much harder if you're trying to stick it together from so many different sources. It's just a greater challenge. It'll depend on the teacher. I do want to address also something that was discussed a moment ago about the degree of similarity you're going to see in the curriculum. I think that that's going to differ in math from English language arts. In English language arts, the standards describe these general skills. There's some differentiation by grade. They also describe this stronger emphasis on informational text, less classic literature, less literature. In math, they're quite specific about topics. And topics, what you learn about, and skills get very content heavy in math. What you can actually do with fractions and what grade. And so one example is that right now, the Massachusetts standards call for most students to be doing Algebra 1 in about 8th grade. Not everyone, accomplished that, but that is a standard. That's where most are going. That's what's tested to a great degree. And the Common Core says, no, you don't have to do it until 9th grade, and that's when it will be tested. So it will be tested later. It will be sort of dumbed down, one might say, or made easier to be less judgmental. So that will be a curriculum decision that will drive testing and will therefore affect people trying to make sure the students do well on their tests. I got some questions on, did I sufficiently answer? I got some questions here about data collection. There's questions about what kind of data will be collected on our students. There are areas in part of the broader Common Core initiative to increase data collection, and the federal government's been providing grants to states to do it and to share that data at different levels. The reality is this has moved so quickly that that's an area where it's not entirely clear where all that data will be shared, how much it will be shared, what kind of protections there will be. There have been some changes in the regulations on student privacy for data to encourage more data sharing. So it's not an area where we can say this is the exact extent of what it will be, but it's another reason why I would argue that this ought to be looked at carefully, and communities ought to study what's going to be done so they're comfortable with it and understand it. And we're quite far from that point at this time. So it's a reason to kick the tires and look under the hood.
I'm going to just kind of distribute the questions. It might go a little faster.
Let me just pick up on the textbook issue. There can be a reason to change literature anthologies. For example, the newer ones are coming out with a lot more, quotes, informational selections in them, less literary selections. So if a school has been using an anthology that has mainly literary selections, it may have to buy a new anthology. It will all depend on what the school is using and whether teachers can take off the internet some of the shorter selections they need to fill in. And there is an attempt by publishers to now have available on the internet maybe chapters of books. Math will be a little more uniform because it's clear what has to be tested per grade in terms of the content of math. In English, because it's a skill, and the skill can be applied to different grade levels and levels of difficulty, which leads to the two questions here, it's not going to be easy to figure out in advance. Now, one question is about honors level classes, AT classes, and electives. Will they still take place at the high school level? All I can say at this point is we don't know. We have no idea what is going to take place. All we can tell you at this point is that the person who developed Common Core's English language arts standards has been put in charge of the college boards. And he's already announced that one of his first tasks is going to be changing the SATs and making them align to Common Core. Now, this is a whole other question of where do you get independent information from on what's happening. If everything's aligned to Common Core, the GEDs have been aligned to Common Core, Many Catholic schools are now being aligned to Common Core, even though they're independent. Many private schools that have accepted voucher students in states where they accept them are now aligning to Common Core. So if everything aligns to Common Core, ACT aligns to Common Core already. That's like the SATs, but it's used in other states mainly. But if everything's aligned to Common Core, how do you find out how dumbed down your standards have been? There's no way to find out if everything's aligned. And this person, David Coleman is his name, he does have a name, who's in charge of College Boards, is going to change the SATs first, and then he's going to change the AP courses. So you may have AP electives in which half of what's in them has to be informational. What will be allowable, we don't know. Those of you who know about AP courses know right now that you have long lists of acceptable readings, and teachers basically choose what they want and make a proposal to the college boards, as I understand it, and somebody approves that this is worthy of the AP in, say, language and composition, or literature and composition, but they can choose from a long list. It's not like the older AP, which had a very specific list of literary readings. This is more of a menu, a smorgasbord of items you could choose from. And it may be that just the items will be grouped differently, and you have to make certain choices within these items, and then the test will be changed. All of this is in the process of being changed.
Can I just piggyback on that? I mean, if you go into college, you're competing with.
Stand up so we can.
When you're going
Speak loud.
in college, you know, my son's a junior, so you compare to other countries. So if they're doing this, what does that mean when they're you know, college is an opportunity to take someone from another country, or take my son, who may be taking AP courses, but how does it compare to these international students that are coming in? We're already, schools are challenging. I mean, how is this all going to affect them?
I think that's a fair question. I just want to make a couple points. One is the Common Core was sold to a lot of folks in the business community, which have backed it. Now, there's been a fair amount of funding of some of the business groups by Pearson and Gates, and they've kind of backed this. But one of the things they were told was that this would be establishing an internationally competitive benchmark. And a lot of businesses are used to the idea of benchmarking to the best in the world. That's what they try to do to be internationally competitive. And so this is how it was sold. But if you look at the final Common Core documents that are published, they no longer say they're internationally benchmarked. They say they're informed by international standards, because they had to back away from the idea that they're internationally benchmarked, because they're not. And so even they had to back away from that statement. They don't make a big deal of it, but now if you look carefully, they say informed rather than benchmarked international standards. So that's a fair point. I want to make one other point. That's a question asked earlier about how will a curriculum be different. One of the suggestions or examples in the English language arts given by Common Core and its supporters is, as far as how schools are supposed to manage with less literature, is instead of having students read an entire text, say Romeo and Juliet, they can read an excerpt or some excerpts. And so if you think about that, what the implications are, now presumably they'll still read some entire text, but others, they'll just read some disjointed excerpts. And anyone who's taught or taken English, you know the kind of analysis you can do of just an excerpt, and the kind of analysis that you do of the ideas in the text and how it's developed over the course of the text are very different. And so it's not going to be, nothing will be read in an entire text, but it's a movement in that direction. And so the implications of that shift are worth thinking about. And here in Massachusetts, I mean, one of the amazing things is you didn't have really bad standards. You had really good standards. And you actually had success with those really good standards. And so one thing I just want to throw out there is you have communities that right now compete to have the best schools, right? And employers, to tell employers, we have the best schools. And to tell individuals thinking of buying a home in their community, we have the best schools. So I would hope some communities decide, hey, we want to preserve the best standards in our community. We want to compete. We don't want to dumb down in our community. It's just something that communities ought to consider. If you can compete on the best schools, why accept dumbing down your standards? Maybe you want to compete on having the highest standards.
That might go into
Ted stand back a little bit. That may go into, Brian Austin, you wanna, okay, can you, it was kind of a long one. If you can stand up and repeat your question, it kind of goes into the Shrewsbury school system and standards and high standards and improvement. So if you can ask the question, maybe it has to do with what we just discussed.
Basically, my question is that the Shrewsbury School District was rated very, very highly in the latest Newsweek article. As a matter of fact, they were in the top 3% nationally. They were 27th in the state. So that shows you that, and they were about in the top 8% in the state. So that shows you a little bit about the background in that. My concern is the system and the administration and the superintendent are working very, very hard at improving this, and to all of a sudden take a tack from this. What are some of the impacts of these changes versus, home rule?
You won't have as much home rule, but let me also add that one of the selling points that has been made over and over again in the past 3 years, and it's still being repeated as if by a parrot, is that we now have more rigorous standards. I mean, you've been, pardon me, but you've been a lot of people have been sold snake oil. And so you have, what happens in a situation like that, where everybody is saying, oh, we've got more rigorous standards now, we have to work harder, the kids are going to do poorer on the test. And I've been looking at test items, and some of these items are unbelievable. They're ridiculous. So yes, kids are going to do worse on many of these test items because they're terrible items. But that doesn't mean that the kids aren't, that there's something wrong with the kids, nor does it necessarily mean that there's something wrong with the teachers either. There's something wrong with the tests and the standards. So the question is, how do you figure it all out when you have none of these independent points of evaluation? So I don't know how people are going to handle, why are they doing what they're doing? They're not consciously dumbing things down. I don't think any educator would be.
I just want to address that. You've had standards here, and you've been very successful. But you've made refinements to them. I know you revised your math standards just a few years ago, and Sandra was very involved with making sure that was improved, the framework, the math framework. The Common Core standards are copyrighted, and not one word can be changed. And so, and you are what you are allowed to do under what you agreed to, or the state board agreed to, provisionally, I guess, is you can add up to 15% of your curriculum to Common Core. But you can't modify anything in Common Core. And not only that, but there's no process described for how the Common Core standards would be refined over time. There's none. No process been defined, no entity's been designated. There's a group that has a copyright over it in DC, Council of Chief State School Officers. Their staff are in DC. They're supposed to represent the state superintendents, but this was all done. None of this work was done outside of DC. And I live in DC. There's nothing wrong with DC. But the idea that you can't change. let me just say that the issue is that in your state, in your local communities, if you find something needs to be refined, right before this, you could go to your state officials and say, this isn't working. We need to refine this. Now they're going to have to be able to say, we can't change this. Here's a number for the Federal Department of Education or DC staff, these folks who copyright it, and you can try your luck with them. And maybe at some point they'll develop a process for refining them. Maybe our views in Massachusetts will outweigh others who happen to like the way they're working in their state, or maybe not. And so none of this has really been developed or defined. And this is all being rolled out with very little information to most people, and some states are deciding that it's not for them.
And I think that speaks to a lot of you have written down in your questions about the local control. I think that answers that question is that we won't have, right now Worcester has 15% discretionary spending on our budget, which doesn't seem like a lot, and it really isn't. And we'll have less and less discretionary spending on our budget. So let's say we wanted to implement this really cool elective for South High, for example. We may not be able to do that because we're strapped because of federal mandates, because they're telling us what we're doing. So it's a very important thing. Our next question is, how does Common Core affect homeschoolers and homeschooling laws? Can either one of you address that? Okay.
Well, I touched on this a little earlier, which is that it's going to depend on the homeschooling laws in each state. And I'm not an expert in Massachusetts specifically, but I'm familiar with the range of homeschooling statutes in different states. And one of the ways it's going to impact many states is because a lot of states require that homeschoolers administer some kind of national standardized test. And I think that's the case here.
It is not.
Some people are saying yes, some people are saying no.
It's not. I know it's not.
They have to have a curriculum similar. A fifth grade student has to be similar in knowledge and ability.
But measured by what?
It depends on what you pick per town. Every town is different. But
Okay,
you could
but
say,
you have to
no,
administer
you could have a
something.
portfolio. No, you could do it via portfolio,
Okay.
via testing.
Okay. Well, the question will be, in your case, if your towns have an impact on this, whether the towns are going to feel compelled to align what they require to Common Core, and that may vary depending on town. We are seeing in some states that they are aligning to Common Core, and they're imposing that on homeschoolers. In some cases, they may not. And so that's a reason for homeschoolers to become knowledgeable and interact with their towns and whoever regulates this. And I would suggest that one of the reasons people choose homeschooling or private schools is because they want something different. And so if you want to continue to have that option, then that needs to be assured. And you are seeing some of these tests, the national standardized tests, such as the Iowa test, the Stanford test, the Comprehensive Test of Basic Skills, these tests that have historically tried to be curriculum neutral or generic. They make some curricular assumptions because they have to design the question. But their effort is to try to look at the range of curriculum standards out there and to try to be as neutral as possible. They have announced that they feel compelled, for economic reasons, to align to Common Core. Now, there will be, if states, in some cases, states, what you described at the town level, they do this at the state level. And so if, wherever level it's done, I would encourage those who are homeschoolers or who need to comply with these kind of regulations to make sure that the type of approved instruments they can use is diverse, that reflects a range of curriculum and academic philosophy, and they're not just all aligned to Common Core. And if that is the expectation and that is the demand, and homeschoolers make their voices known, then there will be a market for it. Because publishers, either smaller ones or big ones or smaller publishers, will provide a range of instruments.
Just on that testing question, Ted, a lot of our testing in the city of Worcester we can opt out of. Will they be able to opt out of the standardized testing associated with Common Core?
I'm not sure exactly what you can opt out of right now, but the idea is that this would meet federal requirements for at least 95% of students to be tested in grades 3 through 8 in English and math, and at least one high school grade, and that these are the tests that are supposed to be used for holding schools accountable, and the Obama administration is pushing that they be used to evaluate individual teachers as well using these tests. There are going to be all kinds of challenges. I'll just quickly mention two, using some of these national tests. These national tests are online, and initially one of them is saying I'll have a paper version for a couple of years, phase in, but fairly quickly they're going to be entirely online. And I think PARCC is supposed to be all online, which is the Massachusetts one. These computer-based tests are trying to include what they call breakthroughs or innovative items that are not multiple choice. And in principle, it sounds like a good idea, right? We don't want just multiple choice items. There's some types of skills and thinking that would be better tested with other kinds of questions. But in order to save money, their intent is to have a lot of the students scored on these non-multiple choice items entirely by computers, by artificial intelligence scoring. Now, there have been advancements in artificial intelligence scoring where they create these algorithms. The computer obviously doesn't know what the student has written and can't make a real judgment, but they create these little algorithms that correlate with what a good result will typically be. If somebody knows the algorithm, they can write gibberish and meet the standards of the algorithm. But they're fairly complicated, and there have been some progress with them. But historically, if you have accountability, if you have sanctions, if you hold teachers accountable, you've always had at least, often you've had 2 raters on these open-ended items, or at least 1 human rater doing a sample. But a significant number in the applications are approved by the Federal Department of Education. A majority of the students' responses would never be seen by a human rater, just by these sort of innovative artificial intelligence. And a sample would be tested by at least 1 human rater. And so there are going to be court challenges, you better believe it. If you have purely computers scoring without any real understanding what the question is, and they're actually going to have consequences for teachers in contracts, there are going to be court challenges. And there's a whole body of law on consequences and sanctions. And just one other example, because a lot of districts aren't ready for fully online testing. Some districts are, but a lot of districts aren't. The other consortium, SBAC, said they might have a 3-month testing window in the spring. Now that creates obvious, so that they can really, cycle the kids through the computer lab over a long period of time. And when you think about the implications for test security, if there are going to be real sanctions, those are very real. And not only that, think about that, some teachers will have their kids go into that test, to take the test, in that case, at the beginning of that 3-month window, so they'll have 3 months less of instruction, and some teachers will just happen to get their kids in at the very end of that. So if you're going to hold teachers accountable, and you're going to have a 3-month testing window, you're going to have serious problems. So there's a lot of things that have not been worked out. Even some of the strongest Common Core advocates, these tests have never been implemented. These are brand new, they're trying to do all these great things. We don't know if they'll succeed, they haven't revealed it, they're not going to release all their questions, and we don't know the price. So there are a lot of unknowns, but a lot of promises. The question is, how much is Bill Gates behind us? There's the Gates Foundation is probably the largest private backer of this. They funded, Pearson is probably one of the other largest, the biggest textbook publishing company. Gates has funded a number of the groups that have done so-called independent reviews of Common Core, which find them very valuable. I don't know all the ins and outs of every group and how much funding, but it's been widely reported that the Gates Foundation is the largest funder, and they've put in hundreds of millions of dollars to different organizations and different state-level organizations and business communities to get them to sign up. And so they really tried to bring everybody together, and I think people can make their own judgments about the appropriateness. I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to give you the facts, and you can weigh those.
One more, and then we'll have Sandra.
How do we find out if our concerns?
Our towns have done their own cost.
How do you find out if your towns have done a cost analysis? Well, you ask them. I don't know. I think the reality is very few school committees have. But at the least, you would expect the state's the one making the decision to adopt Common Core. And you would expect at least the state would do that before they adopt something like this and look at feasibility and maybe have public hearings and maybe go around the state to make sure all the citizens are informed and know what's going on before they actually make the decision. So I think the towns should do it. I think the state should have done it and should still do it. So I don't know what every town has done, but I think you have every right to ask your town what they've done and to ask them to show it to you, to actually put it out there and make it available.
Somebody wanted to know the name of this document. This is the Massachusetts English Language Arts Curriculum Framework, June 2001. It might be listed under archived documents on the Department of Education website. And there are some additional standards that had to be developed in, I think, 03, 04, for some intermediate grades because of No Child Left Behind that wanted testing every single grade level from 3 to 8. This was every 2 years when this came out, which at that time made sense and fit what the legislature had mandated. So,
To that question, Sandra?
there are a lot of changes to the American history curriculum. Well, this is another can of worms, unfortunately. Right now, there have been no changes to the existing Massachusetts History and Social Science curriculum framework, which came out in 2002, 2003. But what is on the horizon from the national level, and it's a mysterious set of social studies standards. We're not quite sure who's authored it. It may be released by CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers, because that seems to be the group that is putting out a framework. It's being called a framework. They're guidelines. They're not standards and they have no content. They're mainly statements of generalizations and questions, and the thinking right now is that they would be layered on to each individual state's own particular history and social science standards. But we don't actually know yet. This is still something that's in the works.
Okay. I was going to have one more for Sandra, and then I'm going to have one more for Ted after that, and then I know Ted I'm sorry.
Ted would like to make some closing remarks, and Sandra also. And then if it's okay, you'll be hanging around here for a little bit, because we have the room till 9. So if you'd like to come up with the questions that maybe you didn't get answered, we've been going at this for a while, and I see a little bit of you following this, nodding off a bit. I'm just gauging the room. That's my job, gauge the room. Hey, Sandra there's a specific question about the IEP, and she can answer that, and then Ted as well.
It says what will happen to the existing IEPs under No Child, that are now under the No Child Left Behind Act. At this point, I don't think we know. There are going to be ways of assessing the special education child with the same test, and they are working out the items to make sure that they meet what may be called universal design principles. I'm sorry if I sound sort of sarcastic, but I discovered when I read the RFPs by 2 of the testing contractors, 2 PARC, that are developing test items. Part of the problem I see with the quality of the test items is that they are drawing for criteria for what constitutes a good test item on 2 different sets of principles. One's called the Principles of Universal Design, and when I looked it up through Google, it seemed as if it was developed for medical care. In other words, if you want to give equal access to a sidewalk, what do you do to your streets or whatever? So you have certain criteria for making sure that everyone has equal access to X, whatever X is. And then there is another set of something called universal designs. It has a different name, and those also have criteria. So if the test items meet all of these criteria, it's not clear whether a child under an IEP would have to take another test or be able to take the same test because the criteria were built in. This is still being worked out, so we cannot. Oh, that's an individual education plan, sorry, that's for students who have been recommended for and been given a special plan for a disability typically. And whatever they are now, they'll continue for a while, but each state is going to have to deal with its own state laws as well as whatever the federal government has set in place. So this is still, it's still it's still going to be worked out. No way to know.
Okay.
I'm sorry. And our last question, and then Ted would like to make some closing remarks, was really probably the most important question of the evening is, what do we do now? What do we do now? We've gathered here together. There's over almost 100 people here. This really shows a high interest in our children and our future of our children. Some of you have come here very much opposed to Common Core. Some of you have been here very much in favor of Common Core. So I thank you for being here and having an open mind. So Ted, would you like to answer, and Sandra maybe, and then some closing remarks? And Sandra and Ted will stay here a little, we have the room till 9. Come on up, and the questions that weren't answered, please come up and address them.
That question's very apropos because that's what I was going to say in my closing remarks. What do we do now? Well, first, I would suggest continuing, spend a little more time after today studying the materials. There's been an awful lot of work done. There's a lot that's on the web. The Pioneer Institute, which published our cost analyses, has detailed reviews, one by Sandra and the ELA, another one by some eminent math experts on the mathematics. Our cost study is there. It's also on our website. There's analysis of the legality of using the federal government, because they're using not only incentives, but also sanctions in terms of waivers. You can only get a waiver if you adopt Common Core or something fairly close to Common Core from some other federal statutes that all districts are trying to get out of. So there's a lot of information. I'd say Pioneer is a good source. There's a couple others. So make sure you really look into it and come up with your own conclusion. We give you our opinion, but you have to come up with your own conclusion. And so I'm going to answer what do we do now as if I was in your shoes, and what I would do is try to oppose Common Core, because that's my view. That's the conclusion I came to. And so, at least certainly if I was in Massachusetts, I think it's a very clear case to me. And so, what I would do is, first of all, let me just say that the example I gave earlier of Indiana, which Indiana had Governor Mitch Daniels that had been involved in pushing Common Core from early on, state superintendent, Republican governor. State superintendent, elected superintendent, Republican state superintendent, is a very strong advocate of Common Core. And that state went from hurtling down the highway, a Common Core highway, at full speed, to legislation being passed, hitting the pause button to review all this. And it started with just 2 moms. And that was it. And they started finding out about this and looked into it, and they organized. And so first I just want to tell you that it may seem like this big thing, all these states are doing it, but it only took 2 moms in Indiana. And of course it grew. But it doesn't have to start big. So that's first. I would say, once you've come to your conclusion about it, start to network. There's some very great groups in these other states. The Indiana group, Heather Crossin, C-R-O-S-S-I-N, is one of the 2 moms, been very active. There's some similar groups. I testified at the legislature there, to the legislature in Utah. There's Utahns Against Common Core. There's similar groups in a number of these other states. There's a group called the American Principles Project, APP, a fellow named Emmett Gorty and Jane Robbins. They've done, rather than the kind of policy work some of us have done, they've done more of the grassroots work with groups in these states that are opposed. So network, there's power in learning from what others have learned about how to do things and sharing ideas. And then here's what I would do here. I would first of all, I would treat this the kind of event we had here, and take it on the road to several different parts of the state. People need to find out about this. You get experts and you get people from the local community kind of sponsoring it and encouraging people to attend. So people need to know more about this. So that's one thing I would do, raise awareness by having real solid information out. and where anybody can ask questions, friendly, critical, and do that around the state. And then I would organize Massachusetts for Preserving High Academic Standards. Citizens, hopefully you get school committees that you don't need a lot, you have 240 or something that become educated about this and say, in our community, we want to maintain high standards. We want to stay with the current standards. Take a vote. Start increasing the number. If you try to say, well, we want everybody to stop right away, the State Department, which is very strongly supportive, is going to say, well, look, these districts over here, they like this. They've already done all this work. You're going to do all the work that they've done. You're going to prevent them from doing it. I would start with your community. Say, in our community, this is not right for our community. We have used these standards. We've had success. We want to start with our community. Don't let them pitch one community against another community and say you're trying to impose something or stop something that somebody else is trying to do in their community. If they want to do it, I don't think it's good necessarily, and it would be ideal if the state changes mind, but I would start community by community, and then grow, organize more and more communities, school committees, reach out to teachers. Don't view this as an us-them kind of thing. Don't view this as a partisan thing. In Indiana, it was a Democratic superintendent that won, that beat with a lot of Republican support. She was very close to the teachers union. They have legitimate concerns about this. There's some things that obviously you might not agree with people with very different political views, but this doesn't have to be a partisan thing. High standards for all of our kids is not a political, or shouldn't be a political issue. So try to get coalitions that reach across sort of ideological and political divides, and make it a grassroots kind of group of people in their community saying, we want high standards. And let the other folks say, be opposed to your community having high standards. That's not a very easy position for somebody else to take. So that's what I would say, and organize, and you're not as big a state as some others, so you have very high education levels, and I think in your state you could do a lot.